Hey everybody, Daniel here. Welcome back to the channel. We'll deal tough questions. Today's question is, has the Bible been corrupted over the centuries? This is a common objection. We live in 2026 and people will be like, you know what? We are far removed in time-wise. What we're holding now is not what was supposedly written then. Over the centuries, it's been corrected, it's been lost, and it's overall been corrupted. Therefore, what we hold now, they would say, is nothing like what supposedly took place then. So, the question we're going to look at today is, has the Bible been corrupted over the centuries? So as we deal with this question about has the Bible been corrupted, we're going to look at two lines of evidences. Now, these lines of evidences are what people would use to look at how accurate historical text would be to the event it's recording. The two lines of evidence is this. First is the date of the manuscript. What I mean by date of manuscript is how early of writing do we have in comparison to the event it's recording. Meaning if an event took place here, do we have a writing, the earliest writing is 100 years later, 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later? So how early of manuscript do we have? Because the larger the time gap, say event took here and the only writing we have is 2,000 years later, then it is possible to have corruption come in. The earlier the time gap, the less possible corruption could come in. So the date of the manuscript. The second is the number of manuscripts. Do we only have one writing or do we have multiple writings? Because when we have one writing, it's hard to tell what's the original text. But if we have multiple writings and early, then it's easier to tell what the original text is. This is specifically called textual criticism, but just simply for us to understand, the more amount of manuscripts you have of a historical document, the more accurate you can know what the original text is. So more is more accurate to the original text. So the two things we're looking at is the date of the manuscripts and the number of manuscripts. So let's look at the first line of evidence, which is the date of the manuscript. What that means is, when did the event take place and when was the manuscript writing about the event written? Meaning, do we have writing 200, 500, 1,000 years later recording event, or is it closer? Remember, the closer is better because the closer means it's more accurate and it's less likely to have been corrupted. Now, before we look at the Bible and specifically the New Testament here, we want to look at some historical texts and we want to see what is the time gap between different historical texts. You have Greek historian Herodotus. The time gap between him and his writing is about 1,350 years. You have Plato, which is about 1,300 years. You have Tacitus, which is about 800 years. You have Suetonius, which is about 800 years. This is not to say these aren't accurate and true. I just want to show you the time gap between them and any manuscript evidence we have. Now let's look at the New Testament. What is the time gap between the New Testament and any manuscript evidence we have? Is it 500, 2,000 years? What is it? No, it is actually only 30 to 40 years. Do you hear that? 30 to 40 years. That time gap is extremely small, making it very accurate and nearly impossible to have been corrupted at all. So let me give you a couple examples of early New Testament manuscripts giving evidence that has not been corrupted over time. The first and the earliest manuscript we have is from the Gospel of John, part of John 18, and this is called the John Ryland Papyrus, and it's dates between 117 and 134 AD. Right, that's the date of the manuscript. Now, the book of John is known to have been written between 60 and 100 AD, and so the date of the manuscript is extremely close, the time gap is extremely close to when John was originally written, meaning that it has been preserved and kept and not corrupted over the time. You also have other things from 150 to 200 AD. You have what's called the Bodmer Papyrus II, and that's with a very short time frame, and that has a lot of the book of John, all right? Has a lot of the book of John. You have the Chester Bedding Papyrus, about 200 AD, which contains a majority of the New Testament. You have the Codex Vaticanus, which is about 325 to 350 AD, which contains nearly the whole New Testament. And you got the Codex Sinaiticus, which is about 350 AD. So you have all these early manuscripts early on that shows the accuracy and how it has not been corrupted over time. You have Frederick Kenyon, who's done a lot of work on kind of looking at this stuff and these discoveries. He states this: no other ancient book has anything like such an early and plentiful testimony to its text, and no unbiased scholar would deny that the text has come down to us is substantially sound. So he's saying it is sound, it has not been corrupted, it's early, and it has not been corrupted. Michael Kruger, another author and researcher, he stated this: the brief space of time between the production of the New Testament and the earliest copies give us access to the New Testament text at a remarkably early stage, making it very unlikely that the textual tradition could have been altered. What is he saying? The text has been preserved, it has not been corrupted. We have very early manuscripts giving weight to it being preserved and not corrupted. Also, I just want to note, you have what's called the chain of custody. All right, for example, let's look at the book of John. The chain of custody was brought to my attention by someone by the name of J. Warner Wallace. And he notes that like when the original author wrote, he then passed on to the person right after him, passed on the person right after him, who passed on the person right after him. For example, John, when he wrote his gospel, all right, and then passed and taught Ignatius, who then passed and taught Polycarp, who passed and taught Irenaeus, and you see it was passed on and preserved over time. It was kept, preserved, and passed on. So that's some evidence we see with the New Testament. Now let's zoom over a little bit with the Old Testament. How was the Old Testament preserved? Well, the Old Testament was meticulously written and kept and passed on. You have Jewish tradition that took very serious the preservation of original texts. The Mishnah, which is the written record of the Jewish tradition from Moses all the way to the first century, states this about how they copied and preserved texts. It says, Moses received the law from Sinai and committed it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets committed to the men of the great synagogue. Now, these men of the great synagogue refer back to people living during the time of Ezra, which is about 400 BC. They took very seriously the preservation and the passing on of the original text. Between 400 BC and 500 AD, you had a group called the Sephardians, and they're known as counters. Don Stewart stated this: these counters counted the number of letters in each complete copy and the number of words in each section of scripture and compared them to the text from which they copied. In other words, they took very seriously what they're doing. It's important to note they didn't copy from memory. They would have what they're writing from and what they're writing on, and they would meticulously copy over. Now, only certain people and well-educated people would be doing this. And they were specific with how they did it. They're specific with even what they wrote it on. They took it very seriously with what they're doing. After them, you have a group called the Masoretics, who then continue doing the same thing. And if you look at your Old Testament, you look at your Bible, and you open up, you see the part where no one looks at, all right, where it will say in the table of contents, it will say this Old Testament is based on the Masoretic text. And the Masoretics were these people. And they wrote from about 500 AD to about 900 AD. And Don Stewart stated this about the Masoretics: they numbered the verses, words, and letters of every book. They calculated the middle word and the middle letter of each. Meaning they were very concerned about passing on the original with great precision. They took it very seriously. So we see that they preserved it. They took very seriously the copying and preservation of the Old Testament text. And so now we want to see, is there any Old Testament early manuscripts? Yes. In the 1940s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And these Dead Sea Scrolls had ancient texts, ancient Old Testament texts dating way early before the time of Jesus, meaning that it's remained completely accurate and true. And compared to what they have now and what we have now, it remained the same over the centuries. Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer stated this: they proved to be word for word identical with the standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consists chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variation in spelling. Now, we'll talk about variations in those in a different video, but for us to understand, it has remained true over the centuries. A big example of this from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the scroll of Isaiah, which is an incredible discovery. And when compared to what they had of Isaiah, it had remained the same over the centuries, meaning that it has not been corrupted over time. So that's the first line of evidence, the date of the manuscripts. Now we want to look at how many do we have? What is the number of manuscripts do we have? Do we only have one? Do we have multiple? What is it? Don Stewart states this, all right? If an ancient work were to come down to us in only one manuscript copy, there would be nothing with which we compare that copy. There's no way of knowing if the scribe was incompetent since we could not check against another copy. Meaning, the more copies we have, early and more copies we have, the more accurate we can know what was originally written. So when we look at the New Testament and the Old Testament, do we have one? Do we have multiple? How many manuscripts do we have? Before I look at what we have with the Bible, let me quickly point out what we have of other ancient texts and the numbers that we have. Herodias, we have 109 old copies. Tacitus, about 31 old copies. Suetonius, about 300. Now, this is not to say these aren't reliable and true, but I want to compare the numbers they have, and now let's look at how many numbers of manuscripts we have in the Old and New Testament. New Testament, we have about 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Wow, that's incredible. And about 18,000 plus non-Greek translations, such as Coptic, which dates back to the 3rd century, Latin, which dates back to the 4th century, Gothic, which dates back to the 5th century. The Old Testament, we have about 42,300 scrolls and writings, some which are relatively new, but others date really old, like Dead Sea Scrolls. You put both the old and the new manuscripts evidence together, we have about 66,000 biblical manuscript evidence. There's nothing in ancient history that even compares to this wealth of evidence. This is not even to mention the quotations we have of the early church fathers where they would quote the New Testament. We have about 36,000 quotations from the early church fathers that even if we didn't have the Greek manuscripts, which again, I pointed out we have about 5,800 Greek Greek manuscripts. If we didn't even have those, we'd still be able to reconstruct the majority of the New Testament from just the early church fathers' quotations. That's incredible. Michael Kruger stated this, that there is 3 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the average Greco-Roman author has in 2,000 years. That is mind-blowing. Let me give you this example, and I've heard this before from different authors, that if we were to stack all the ancient writers, their manuscripts, all right, it would stack about 4 feet high. If we were to get all the manuscript evidence for the Bible and stack it, it would stack about 2.5 miles high. That is incredible amount of manuscript evidence. So what I hope you see today is this: the Bible is trustworthy and true and has not been corrupted over the centuries. And we can say that because we have early manuscript evidence and we have lots of manuscript evidence. Early and lots of manuscript evidence, giving weight that it's been preserved and kept accurate through the centuries, that what you hold today is accurate and true and has not been corrupted over the centuries.